Thank you for joining us around the fire. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The train jerked to a halt in the foothills of Transylvania. Inside one of the small compartments, Stephanie Archer looked nervously out the window. "I wonder what's the matter," she asked. Her mother and brother, sitting across from her, both shrugged their shoulders. "I'm glad it's still daylight," Stephanie said, looking out at the dense, green forest around them. "Scared of vampires?" her brother asked. "Oh, sure," Stephanie answered sarcastically. "Well, then you won't mind if I read to you from Dracula, will you? I thought it was fitting, us riding through Transylvania and all." Mrs. Archer sighed. "Really, Robert?" Then, the slow grinding of the wheels against the track began again. Soon the train had picked back up to its normal speed. Stephanie settled back against the old velvet seat and relaxed. Robert pulled a battered copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula from his knapsack. Mrs. Archer went on reading her own novel. The three of them had the train compartment, which could sit 6, all to themselves. Robert began to read aloud. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for his white hair and mustache were changed to dark, iron gray. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on his lips were bits of fresh blood, which trickled down from the corners of his mouth and ran over the chin and neck. "Oh, stop it, Robert," Stephanie interrupted. "I'm just trying to set the mood for our journey," Robert protested. "Here we are in the heart of vampire country. We might as well enjoy it." "Robert, stop reading aloud if it bothers your sister," Mrs. Archer insisted. "We'll be meeting your father tomorrow, thank goodness. Then I'm turning both of you over to him." Robert picked Dracula up again and started to read silently. Stephanie gazed out the window. The train was climbing out of a valley into the mountains. "Listen to this!" Robert exclaimed and started to read aloud again. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech. "Mother, make him stop." I'll stop, Robert said hastily. "I didn't know you were so sensitive, Stephanie." Just then, the train came to another halt. All three of them looked out to see where they were. "Quite a few people are getting on," Robert said, craning his head out the window. "I hope no one comes in here," Stephanie said. But a minute later, they heard footsteps in the corridor, and the door to their compartment slid open. A short, well-dressed, elderly man stuck his head inside. "May I join you? I'm afraid the other compartments are full." "Of course," Mrs. Archer said. "Please come in." The elderly man sat by the door, beside Stephanie. "My name is Dr. Moorer. You are Americans, are you not?" "Yes, that's right. I'm Mrs. Rita Archer. This is my daughter Stephanie and my son Robert." The old man beamed a smile at everyone. "Very happy to meet you." The train jerked forward and then began to pull out of the station. "Where do you—" Mrs. Archer began to say to the doctor. But she stopped as the compartment door slid open again. A tall, middle-aged man walked into the compartment. He didn't say a word. Without hesitation, he walked to the window and sat down on the other side of Stephanie. Stephanie snuck a glance at the new man sitting beside her. She saw his black hair, his pale white skin, and his red lips. They were red, those lips. Ruby red. Stephanie looked over at Robert, who met her gaze and raised his eyebrows. The second stranger's presence invaded the entire compartment. No one seemed to know what to say. Stephanie moved over on the seat, closer to the old doctor. It suddenly seemed to her that the dark stranger's body was cold, unnaturally cold. She started to shiver and couldn't stop. "Robert, could you get me a sweater?" Sure, Steph." Robert stood up to get a sweater from the overhead rack. As he did, the copy of Dracula fell from his lap onto the floor, at the stranger's feet. Robert bent over to pick it up, but the stranger already held it in his bony hand. He gave it back to Robert. There was a smirk on his face, and his hard black eyes looked deep into Robert's. Robert sat down again, forgetting about the sweater. Mrs. Archer handed over her sweater to Stephanie. Then she said to the doctor, "It's always nice to have a doctor around." The old doctor smiled kindly. Everyone settled back into an awkward silence. The strange man sat perfectly still beside Stephanie. As the light began to fade in the sky, his white face took on a greater contrast to his black hair and black suit. Stephanie cast quick glances at him as she pretended to stare intently out the window. She couldn't get those words from Dracula out of her mind. This man was so strange, and they were in Transylvania. "Robert," Mrs. Archer said softly, "could you switch on the light, please? It's getting difficult to read." As Robert reached up to flick on the light switch, the doctor reached over and touched his arm. "Please, Mrs. Archer, wait a few more minutes with the light if you don't mind. As a frequent traveler through these parts, I can recommend watching the countryside now. It is twilight, near sunset. The sky will be full of beautiful colors for the next half hour. You really shouldn't miss it." "Of course, Doctor," Mrs. Archer agreed. Stephanie leaned her head against the seat back. If only she could enjoy the countryside, she thought, but with that man so close to her. The train took a sharp turn, and everyone was thrown to the right. The stranger's body pressed against Stephanie. She tried to move away, but her body was wedged between him and the doctor. The train straightened its course, but the man didn't move away from Stephanie. She turned to him. He was looking deep into her eyes. Just as she felt herself about to scream, he moved away from her. The train was puffing to a slow stop in a small village. Suddenly, unbelievably, the dark stranger got up and left the compartment as quickly as he had entered it. They watched him as he stepped onto the station platform and walked toward a young woman who was waiting there. As the train drew away from the station, they could see the two kissing. Robert and Stephanie looked at each other and then started to laugh hysterically. Mrs. Archer smiled as she rearranged her things on the seat. The old doctor continued to smile at everyone. "You two are ridiculous," Mrs. Archer said to Stephanie and Robert. "Stop giggling." But then she laughed herself. "I think I'll go and wash up now," Mrs. Archer said. She stood up and turned around to reach for her bag on the overhead rack. After she got it down, she stopped to check her face in the mirror. In the reflection behind her own face, she saw Stephanie sitting alone on the opposite seat. "Why, where did the doctor?" she began to say. But when she turned around, the doctor was still in his seat. How odd, Mrs. Archer thought as the train plunged into another dark mountain tunnel. She sat back down again. The shrill train whistle pierced through the air. The rattle of the wheels on the tracks echoed throughout the tunnel. No other sound could be heard in the pitch blackness of the compartment. 3 minutes later, the train shot back out into the velvet blue twilight. "Stephanie!" Mrs. Archer shrieked. Stephanie was slumped across the seat, her head thrown back. Blood dribbled down from 2 small holes in her neck. An unnatural smile played on her lips. "Doctor," she whispered. But the doctor was gone, and a full moon shone brilliantly in the Transylvanian sky. It was the night guard's first night of duty in the Egyptian rooms of the museum. He had been assigned to work in the Viking room for many months before this. He plopped his large body down on a hard bench by the wall. His bloodshot eyes surveyed the room. There were huge stone sculptures of lions with the heads of men, and wall paintings filled with strange symbols. There were jars, clothing, utensils, and, what interested him the most, mummies and coffins. "I should have myself a good time in here," he muttered to himself, and then he let out a cackling laugh. The guard had a good time in the Viking section of the museum as well. That was the reason for his transfer to the Egyptian wing. No one had been able to prove he had done it, of course, but he knew he was suspected. It was worth it, though. He had enjoyed scratching that word into the old Viking stone and putting that cigarette butt into the mouth of the fake Viking warrior. There were other things he had done too, things that they hadn't even caught yet. He hated museums, always had, ever since his mother had dragged him through them as a child, and he didn't like being a night guard in this museum. But what else could he do? It was the only job he could find. Anyway, at least he could make sure that he wouldn't get bored. The guard heaved his heavy body off the bench and began making a slow circuit around the long room. After a few steps, he stopped in front of a huge wall painting. It was filled with weird symbols and pictures of people with animal heads. A woman with the head of a bird, a man with the head of a cow, another man with the head of a fox. There was also a bird with the head of a man, and a monstrous thing with the head of an alligator. "Rubbish," the guard muttered. But he stooped to see the title of the picture on the wall plaque. "The Seal of Judgment," it read. Underneath the title were these words: "The Egyptians thought that when a man died, his soul went before judges, all seated in a great hall. The judges wanted a report on the way he had behaved while on earth. Then the man's heart was weighed on a scale against a feather, the symbol of truth and justice." This was to find out if the man had spoken the truth to the judges. If he had lied, he was immediately fed to the monster with a crocodile head. The guard finished reading the plaque on the wall. Then he looked at the picture again. The scale was there, a heart on one side and a feather on the other, and the monster with the crocodile head was waiting beside the scale. The guard took a few steps backwards from the wall painting, but he didn't take his eyes off the crocodile. It fascinated him. "Does it scare you?" The voice made every muscle in the guard's body jump. He swung his large body around to face the speaker. It was the assistant curator of the museum, smiling. "I didn't mean to scare you," the curator said in a slow, measured voice. "I wanted to know if the painting scared you." The guard was embarrassed now. His embarrassment quickly turned to anger. "That old junk doesn't scare me," he said. "What do you mean sneaking up on me like that?" The guard glared down at the short curator. "I didn't sneak up on you," the curator answered in slow speech. "On the contrary, I walked quite normally. It's your job to be alert, after all." The guard didn't reply. He was seething with anger. "And furthermore," the curator went on, "this isn't junk. Our museum has one of the best collections of Egyptian artifacts in the world." "Doesn't interest me," the guard said, walking away from the curator. "I think it's junk." The curator's face went red. "We're on to your tricks, you know. If we weren't so short-staffed, I'd have you fired." The guard turned around and stared at the curator with an insolent look on his face. "You just watch yourself," the curator kept it up. "If you disturb anything in this room, you could be sorry." The Egyptians knew a lot about magic and curses and had great respect for their dead. You had better not try any of your tricks in here. The little curator continued his lecture until he walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The guard began his circuit of the room again. Now he had a surly scowl on his face. As he passed the Egyptian paintings and statues, he began to hate them more and more. The humans with animal heads seemed to threaten him with their beaks and claws and strange, passive faces. "You better watch yourself," the guard mimicked the curator's words. "They can have this job," he muttered. The guard stopped to pull out a stick of chewing gum from his pocket. In front of him was a wooden coffin. The sign beside it indicated that it belonged to a princess. It was in the shape of a human body. The coffin bottom lay flat on the floor. The decorated coffin lid stood upright at the foot of the bottom. As he began to chew his gum, the guard stared at the pictures on the decorated lid. The body of the lid was covered with feathers, human figures, snakes, and strange symbols. On top of the lid, there was a face, the face of an Egyptian woman. She had large, almond-shaped black eyes. The guard found himself staring into them. "Ow!" The guard had bitten his tongue while chewing his gum. The pain snapped him back to reality. For a moment, he had become lost in that woman's eyes. He put his fingers in his mouth and took out the gum. He looked around for a place to put it. Opposite the coffin was a mummy. It was the son of the princess. The guard looked at the mummy's human shape, wrapped in yellowing strips of cloth. He laughed under his breath. Then he stuck his piece of gum onto the back of the mummy's head. Now he laughed louder. But suddenly he stopped. He felt as though someone was behind him, watching. He whirled around, but no one was there. Only the coffin. The woman's eyes were staring at him just as before. The guard started to walk away from the coffin, but he found he couldn't take his eyes away from the woman's face. They seemed to be paralyzing his body. The first sickly feeling of fear crept into the guard's mind. He remembered the curator's words. They had magic and curses, and respected their dead. Then he remembered that the mummy was this woman's son. The guard struggled to leave the spot where he stood. He swore at the coffin lid. He tried to reach out and knock it over, but he couldn't help himself. He seemed to be sinking deeper and deeper into the black eyes of the woman. Those eyes seemed to beckon him, to hypnotize him. They were like bottomless black pits set into the white, passive face of death. The guard found himself being drawn forward, toward the coffin. His brain was slowing down, becoming sleepy. As he came within inches of the woman's eyes, Suddenly they closed. Instantly, his own eyes went toward the coffin bottom. He saw that it was bigger than it first seemed, big enough for him to lie down in. The guard was falling asleep. He let his body slip down into the soft, cushioned bottom of the coffin. He stretched himself out. With his hands by his side, his body fit perfectly. Just before he fell asleep, the guard opened his eyes once more. He looked up at the inside of the coffin lid, which faced him at the bottom of his feet. He saw the woman's face was painted on the inside of the lid, too. Her eyes were watching him. But these eyes were blacker yet. Black with revenge. The guard slipped off into strange dreams, just as the coffin lid fell neatly down over the coffin bottom. He lay in darkness. Then, the airtight, eternal darkness of an Egyptian coffin. And somewhere, the monster with the crocodile's head was waiting for him. Many people have a phobia, an unnatural fear they can't control. But Ellen's phobia bordered on the fringe of madness. She would go into hysteria even at the sight of a small field mouse. Perhaps she had a right to be afraid after what happened that night. It was late when Ellen left the small restaurant where she had eaten dinner alone. The restaurant stood on one side of the large city park, and because it was a warm summer night, Ellen decided to walk through the park to her apartment on the other side. She started down a path overhung by leafy trees. It was surprisingly dark on the path, dark enough to make Ellen feel uneasy. She quickened her pace, thinking she should get to the other side of the park as soon as possible. She had heard stories about things, unpleasant things, that happened to people in the park at night. Then, coming out of the shaded path into an open area, she saw the sky was still light. She decided to walk a little slower, but she couldn't completely forget her uneasiness, or the stories. She walked on through the park toward the lake in the middle. Soon another path loomed ahead, shaded by thick trees. Ellen looked in the distance down the path. No one seemed to be on it. She looked behind her, wondering if she should turn back around. But by now she had walked into the center of the park. There was no point in turning back. Once on the shaded path, she could hear no sounds but the rustle of leaves. The sounds of the city were drowned out here. Ellen walked on, listening to the leaves whispering in the night air. She felt as though she were 1,000 miles from civilization. But then her ears picked up another sound. It wasn't a sound from the city outside, and it wasn't a sound from the trees either. She listened to her own footsteps on the cement path, and told herself that was all she had heard. But no, she heard it again. An echo of her own footsteps behind her. She was sure of it now. There were other footsteps following her. Fear crept into her mind. It made her heart pound and her legs walk faster. Soon Ellen knew she had reason to be afraid. The footsteps behind were keeping pace with hers. They had quickened with her own. She kept herself from running, knowing she must not show her fear. She knew she must stay in control of herself. Forcing her legs to slow down, she realized the footsteps behind her were not slowing down. They came up from behind, quickly, eagerly. Ellen couldn't control her fear any longer. She broke into a run down the path. The footsteps didn't follow right away, but then, over the pounding of her heart, she heard them hitting the pavement, fast and steady. Ahead, Ellen saw the path that went down to the lake. She knew that people more often came to the lake than any other place in the park. She ran down a small hill toward the lake. As she rounded a corner, her heart sank. The path by the lake was deserted too, and now the footsteps behind her were coming down the hill and were catching up to her. Ellen looked around wildly. There was a dense area of bushes and trees to her left. She ran on for a few steps and then threw herself into hiding in the bushes. Maybe, she prayed, the footsteps would go by. It was dark now. Only a half-moon penetrated the night with its mellow light. Ellen heard the footsteps first. Then she saw the shadow that belonged to them. The man stopped walking 20 feet from where she was hiding. He stood silent for a minute with his back to her. Then he walked over to a bench at the lake's edge and sat down on it. In the bushes, Ellen was sweating. She wondered why she had ever stopped running. Nothing could be worse than this. The man must know she was hiding. Was he going to wait it out until she couldn't stand to hide any longer? Then Ellen thought that others might come along on the path. She would have to jump out of the bushes then and could walk out of the park with them. She looked over at the man on the bench again. He sat calmly looking out at the lake. Something caught her eye. There was a small shadow moving along the water's edge. It stopped. Silhouetted against the night sky, Ellen could see the head of a large rat. She started to get up off the ground. That was always her reaction to mice, to stand on a chair, to get up off the floor in any way possible. But now, she couldn't get up, and she couldn't let loose the scream choking in her throat. As if in a bad nightmare, 3 more rats joined the one by the lake. Ellen could see their fat shadows and their ugly rodent heads in the moonlight, and she could hear the clatter of their claws on the cement path. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but the bigger shadow on the bench scared her more. The rats not more than 5 feet away from him. He must see them, Ellen thought. She switched her eyes back to the rats. They hypnotized her with loathing fear. She heard a rustle in the bushes, not more than 2 feet from her. She had to gag her mouth with her sweater to keep from screaming. What if a rat came up to her? What if it jumped on her with its sharp claws? Then, with horror, Ellen saw that the 4 rats by the lake's edge were coming toward her. Their sharp rodent noses were pointing at her. Their long tails were switching back and forth. Ellen screamed. She saw the shadow on the bench stand up. It started to come at her toward the bushes. She struggled to her feet. As she took a step backwards, her foot fell into a deep hole. It was a rat's nest. Dozens of baby rats squealed in panic and crawled out of the hole around her foot. They were everywhere, scuttling away in desperation. Ellen jerked her foot out of the hole. As she stepped back again, her foot landed on the soft body of a baby rat. It squealed in agony, and Ellen screamed and screamed again. Then Ellen saw the shadow of the man moving closer and closer to her. She struggled to get out of the bushes, although her knees were weak with fear. Finally, she pushed her way through the thick branches and stepped onto the path going back up to the hill. The man had seen her. He came nearer. There in the pale moonlight, Ellen saw his face. Her body was filled with revulsion. It was the face of a huge rat, its whiskers twitching. Ellen ran. Terror, mindless terror, carried her down the path out of the park. She did not hear footsteps following behind her. All she heard was the high, unnatural squealing of rats. Ellen ran on and on until she finally escaped from the park. But the rat? She would never really escape him. He was still there, in her mind. Hugo lived alone. He had no family, no real friends, not even a pet. Monday through Friday, he went to work at the office as an accountant. Every day he added columns of numbers, and once every 2 weeks he made out the paychecks for the company. That was the closest he'd ever come to the other employees, typing their names on a paycheck. Hugo spent the weekends alone. On Saturdays he watched television, and he carefully read through every piece of junk mail that he received during the week. Hugo always answered the ads for free information. On Sundays he read the newspaper and took a walk. He didn't mind living such a solitary life. He didn't like people, really. But sometimes, Hugo could tell when he had been alone too long. Sometimes, when he had to talk to someone, his voice sounded like a stranger's. When that happened, he would make a point of eating out in a restaurant. He would ask the waitress questions and listen to what other people were saying, and that usually got him back to normal. One Monday morning, Hugo woke up at exactly 7:30 as he did every other morning. It had been a 3-day weekend because of a holiday on Friday. Hugo had not left his apartment for 3 days. The weather had been too bad to take a walk on Sunday, so he had stayed in to watch television and read the papers. Hugo groaned and stumbled out of bed. His head felt groggy this morning. He went into the bathroom and turned on the cold water. Then he splashed his face with the water to try and clear his head. But he still felt strange. After he dried his face, Hugo looked in the mirror. He always did that in the morning. Hugo looked in the mirror for a long time this morning. He didn't seem to be thinking straight, and what he saw in the mirror didn't make sense. He stared straight into the reflection of his eyes. Then he looked at his nose, his mouth, his forehead. The more he looked at himself, the more it seemed that he was looking at the face of a stranger. "That's not me," he thought to himself. "That can't be me." But as he moved his face up and down, the reflection also moved up and down. Hugo shut his eyes and shook his head back and forth. Then he looked at the mirror again. The stranger's face hadn't gone away. It was staring right back at him. "My God," said Hugo. He put his hands to his face, and it did the same. Suddenly he needed to know if he was still himself. He ran to the closet. His clothes were all neatly hung in rows, arranged according to color. He pulled open a dresser drawer. His wallet was there, and his driver's license still had his name on it. Hugo sighed with relief. Then he looked up at the mirror over the dresser. The stranger was looking back at him. "That isn't me," Hugo said in a trembling voice. "I don't look like that." Hugo dressed himself in one of his oldest suits, one that he had worn hundreds of times. It made him feel secure. Then he went into the kitchen, put on some coffee, and poured himself a bowl of cereal. As he picked up the big spoon, he saw the stranger's distorted face staring at him, upside down. "I don't look like that," Hugo repeated. Suddenly, he thought of a way to prove it. A picture, he thought. There must be a picture of me. But he couldn't think of any. No one had ever taken a picture of him that he could remember. He began to shake inside. There had to be a way to prove that he was not the stranger that he saw reflected in the mirror. By now it was 8:15. He would have to be at his desk in 45 minutes. Hugo didn't know what to do. He couldn't go into his office looking like a stranger, but he couldn't stay home either. It was the 15th of the month. The employees were supposed to get their checks today. Hugo got ready to go to the office. He avoided looking in any mirrors, As he locked the door to his apartment, his neighbor, Mrs. Reynolds, passed him on the street. "Good morning, Hugo," she said, and Hugo returned her greeting. Then he realized what it meant. He looked like his old self to her. He almost went back to the apartment to check the mirror again, but then he remembered that there was a mirror at the front of the bus that he would ride to the office. He walked to the bus stop and waited, humming a song. He felt better now. The bus pulled up and Hugo walked on. As he gave the driver his money, he stooped to look in the mirror. To his horror, the stranger stared back, with an eager grin on his face. Hugo slumped into a seat. He rode all the way to his office with his eyes shut. There was a window by his seat, and every time he looked at it, the reflection of the stranger's face was there. At 9 o'clock, Hugo was in his office at his desk. He sat there, waiting for someone to notice, but no one did. The women who worked in the accounts department with him acted perfectly normal. They paid no more attention to him than they usually did. Hugo felt as though he were going mad. 4 times during the day he went to the restroom to check. The mirror always confirmed his fears, that he looked like a total stranger, and no one even noticed. Hugo went home that night and went directly to bed. He hid in the dark bedroom until sleep put his exhausted mind to rest. When he woke the next morning, he was afraid to look in the mirror. He avoided it, but he had to shave if he went to work. It was hard shaving the stranger's face. His hands were shaking. It went like that Tuesday morning and Wednesday morning and Thursday morning. Friday morning, Hugo woke up at 7:15 and lay in bed for a very long time. He didn't want to get up. He felt as though he couldn't go on living with that stranger's face. He stayed in the bedroom for an hour. Finally, the fear of being alone with the face all day forced him out of bed. He decided he would go to work, even though he was late. He went to the bathroom and began to shave automatically. Then he dropped the razor. It was his old face, his own face back in the mirror again. Hugo ran his hands all over his face. It really was him. This was how he looked. He let out a crazy laugh. The stranger had gone, disappeared, and he was himself again. Hugo finished shaving, dressed, and rushed out of the house without having breakfast. He was eager to get to work now, eager to have people see him. As he was locking the front door, Mrs. Reynolds passed by on the street. She looked at him suspiciously and didn't say good morning, but Hugo was too happy to notice that she was acting strangely. He sprang up the steps into the bus and handed the driver his money. Stooping down, he saw his own face smiling back at him in the driver's mirror. On the ride to the office, he would turn to the window every few minutes. He wanted constant reassurance that his face would be there in the reflection, and it always was. At 9:30, Hugo pushed open the door to the accounts department. The receptionist was calling to him from her desk in the hallway, but he didn't pay attention. He just wanted to get to his desk because he was late. Hugo strode across the room to his desk, which sat in a corner. He put his briefcase on the desk and sat down in his chair. He noticed the constant sound of typing in the room had stopped. Now there was no sound at all, as a matter of fact. Hugo smiled as he saw Miss Rose, the head clerk, walking toward his desk. "Yes, Miss Rose," he said. Miss Rose stopped a few feet from his desk. "Who are you?" she asked. Hugo laughed at the joke. Miss Rose was being especially friendly today. "Why are you sitting in Hugo's desk?" Miss Rose demanded. And Hugo stopped laughing. He looked into Miss Rose's eyes. The truth crept like a sinister madman into his mind. Miss Rose was looking at a total stranger. He could see that she didn't recognize him. Hugo gripped both sides of the desk. "Who are you?" Miss Rose repeated. But Hugo didn't answer. His mind was too busy, making its strange, spiraling descent into total madness. During the California gold rush of 1849, 3 men were holed up in a small cabin for the night. They sat around the jumping flames of the fire and warmed themselves. Outside, the wind whistled and moaned through the canyon. Every so often, a coyote howled. The 3 men were old friends who had shared the hopes and disappointments of gold prospecting. This was their last night out in the hills. The next day, they planned on heading to San Francisco to find work. All of them were broke. "Damn coyotes," Billy said. "We're lucky we found this place," Jeremiah said slowly. "They're hungry tonight." Another coyote howled above the sound of the wind. This one was closer. The 3 men looked at each other nervously. "I still don't like moving into deserted cabins like this," the 3rd man, named Dusty, complained. "You don't know why people left." He paused for a moment. "Nobody leaves without a reason." "Well, you can go out and sleep with the coyotes then, Dusty," Jeremiah said as he rolled out his sleeping bag. The fire was beginning to burn lower. The other 2 men rolled out their bags and settled down for the night. All was silent inside the cabin. Outside, the coyotes and the wind kept up their eerie symphony. Jeremiah woke from deep sleep with a start. He looked around, trying to remember where he was. The cabin, yes, the cabin, he thought drowsily. But what had woken him? He lay his head back down and shut his eyes. Then he heard it. The breathing. It was fast, excited breathing, coming in short gasps. He looked over to the fireplace where Billy was sprawled out, asleep. Jeremiah's blood froze at what he saw. A face, nothing but the hideous face of an old woman, was hovering over Billy's body. The short gasps of breathing were coming from the hag's face. Jeremiah could see the lips opening and closing with the breathing. "Billy!" he screamed. Billy shuddered in his sleep. Then he raised himself to his elbows and slowly opened his eyes. His face was only 2 inches from the face of the old hag. Jeremiah watched as his eyes widened in horror as he looked at it. The hag's face was old and wrinkled. The skin was blistered by the sun and disease. Hair stood out on her head like twisting snakes, and her eyes were full of hatred. Jeremiah could hear its panting breath come faster. Billy parted his lips in a scream. Then the hag breathed a long, deep breath into his lungs. As Billy's body slumped backwards, the face disappeared. "My God," Jeremiah said softly. He didn't believe in ghosts, and his mind couldn't make any sense of what he had just seen. But that didn't make any difference now. He kicked Dusty with his foot to wake him up. Then he ran over to check Billy, but Billy was dead. "We gotta get out of here, Dusty," Jeremiah said. "Billy's dead. There was a face, an old hag's face. I don't know, it was a ghost or something." Dusty was lying on his sleeping bag, eyeing Jeremiah suspiciously. "You cracking up, Jeremiah?" he asked. But Dusty didn't say any more, because he found out what Jeremiah meant. The face materialized out of the air in front of him. Once again, the cabin filled with the sound of the old hag's breathing. Dusty's face worked itself into an expression of horror. "Keep your mouth shut, Dusty," Jeremiah screamed in warning, but it was too late. Dusty's mouth opened wide in a scream. The hag's face breathed death into his body through its withered lips. Then it disappeared. Jeremiah backed against the cabin wall. He looked down at his two dead friends. A coyote pierced the silence with its hungry howl. Jeremiah ran for the door. A foot away from escape, the hag's face appeared before him. Jeremiah's legs stiffened with fright. His hand froze on the door latch. The old woman's eyes were looking into his. He could see the pattern of wrinkles and scars on her face. He could feel her panting breath and felt himself choking. His breath seemed stuck in his lungs. The face was coming nearer and nearer. He struggled to keep his mouth shut. He thought of Billy and Dusty. He jerked aside the door latch and threw the cabin door open, watching as the door swung right through the hag's face. She disappeared once again. Jeremiah grabbed the rifle by the door and ran down into the canyon. He ran until he felt his lungs would burst. His own hard breathing sounds haunted him. It sounded like the breathing of the old hag following him. He kept running until the night broke into daylight. Finally, he threw himself down, exhausted, on a flat rock. For the first time since his escape from the cabin, he began to gather his distracted thoughts. Billy and Dusty were dead. Something had killed them. Jeremiah could still see the hag's hideous face in his mind. What was she? He wondered. The mad ghost of a prospector's wife seeking revenge? An evil spirit left by the indigenous people who had been forced out of these mountains by the gold rush? Or was that the face that death wore? And now that she had shown herself to him, was there any escape? Suddenly, Jeremiah realized how horrible his situation was. Someone was sure to find Billy's and Dusty's dead bodies, and nobody would believe his story about the hag's face. People would say he killed his partners for gold, and there would be no way for him to explain it. For a moment, Jeremiah thought he might go crazy. Then, he realized there was only one way out. He had to get out of the mountains fast, before someone found the bodies. Far in the distance, he saw the dusty trail of a stagecoach. It was coming his way up the mountain. There was the answer, he decided. He would ride the stagecoach out of the territory. Jumping to his feet, Jeremiah ran down the canyon to the stagecoach road below. He had little time to catch his breath before he flagged down the driver. "Climb in, there's plenty of room," the driver shouted at him. As Jeremiah climbed into the coach, he saw that there was only one other passenger, a woman. He settled back into his seat and looked across at her. She was young and beautiful. He smiled to himself as he thought of his luck. Not only had he escaped the horrible death-breathing hag, but now he was sitting across from this charming girl. The young woman saw him looking at her, and she smiled shyly back at Jeremiah. As the stagecoach rocked slowly from side to side, Jeremiah's tense body began to relax. Everything will work out all right, he thought to himself, and he drifted off to a contented sleep. He woke suddenly with a start. His heart was pounding wildly. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The stagecoach. Yes, the stagecoach, he thought drowsily. But what had awakened him? Then he heard it. The breathing. It was fast, excited breathing, coming in short gasps. Jeremiah looked up. The young woman was staring at him. He saw her lovely lips opening and closing with the breathing. Jeremiah's eyes took on a wild look. He thought of Billy and Dusty. The breathing seemed to get louder. It seemed to pound in his ears. He crouched into the corner of the stagecoach. Desperately, he looked out the window. The coach was going around a hairpin curve next to a cliff that fell sharply to the deep canyon below. He looked at the woman again. She was still staring at him. Her breath was coming louder still. The whole stagecoach seemed to fill with it. "No," Jeremiah moaned softly. "Is there something wrong?" the young woman asked as she got up from her seat and sat beside Jeremiah. He shrank back against the stagecoach door. He watched as the woman's face came closer to him. She was lifting her hand to his forehead. He could feel her breathing against his face. "No!" Jeremiah screamed as he turned the latch on the door and jumped out of the stagecoach. His scream echoed up from the canyon as his body tumbled down the steep cliff. Then, the young woman heard no more. She sat sobbing in the stagecoach, terrified with fright. It was her first trip out west, and she just watched as a man that she'd never met before leapt to his death. Jonas Ellerby turned his car into the plantation driveway at twilight. The long path from the road to the house was lined with giant cedar trees. Spanish moss drooped from their branches. The grass along the driveway had long ago turned to weeds. Now, already, the color of things was fading with the light. The trees were more like silhouettes. Jonas felt the atmosphere of the place surround him. He was from the north, and this landscape was strange and new to him. The driveway took a sudden, sharp turn, and the house appeared. Jonas drew in his breath when he saw it. The house was not what he had expected. He had gotten his idea of southern plantations from Hollywood movies. Jonas stopped the car and turned off the engine. He stared at the great sweep of the house. Its long veranda stretched out underneath tall white pillars. Window after window stared at him like curious eyes. In one, Jonas thought he saw a light go out, but then he decided it must have been a reflection. Jonas looked up to the second story of the house. Something was wrong with it. The rooms sagged at a crazy angle to one side. The roof looked as though it had been blown on by too many storms, and the color of the house was not the blinding bright whiteness of the plantations in the movies. It was a dull gray, an almost rotten color. It was a dying house, and Jonas was here to bury it. Jonas represented the firm of Stanton and Stanton. The firm represented the estate of Mr. Wigover, the former owner of the house. The estate had gone into bankruptcy. Jonas had come to make plans to tear down the old house and sell off the land to a real estate dealer. Even though people had warned him that the house had a strange reputation, he had come this evening to spend the night inside of it. Jonas got out of his car and slammed the car door shut. He decided he would explore the premises in the fading twilight. He followed the stone path up to the house, and then walked up deteriorating steps onto the veranda. An old rocking chair sat there, moving slightly in the evening breeze. Jonas took the key he had been given and put it into the front door lock. To his relief, the door opened. As he stepped inside, Jonas was overwhelmed by the smell of dampness and decay. The air seemed steeped in the odor of age. He wondered how long it had been since another human had stepped foot inside of this house. He walked past the grand stairway which swept up to the second story and entered a sitting room full of dusty, moldy furniture. His footsteps echoed on the bare floors as he went room to room. The dining room, the ballroom, the study, the kitchen. Just as he was making his way back to the front door, Jonas passed a room he hadn't entered before. He opened the door and peeked inside. It was a small bedroom, sparsely decorated and neat. The sheets and pillowcases were no longer fresh but obviously clean. And this room didn't have the damp smell to it. Jonas stood and looked around the room for a moment. Then he smiled and went to get his luggage from the car. By the time he had unpacked his things for the night and put them away, twilight had faded into night. Jonas knew the house had no electricity, but he found a partially burned candle on the nightstand by the bed. As he fumbled for his matches in the darkness, he heard a chorus of crickets begin their shrill evening song. The candle blazed a light, and that is when he first noticed the book. It was sitting on the nightstand, as if someone had laid it out just for him. The title on the faded cover was The Old Plantation. Jonas decided he might read it later, when he turned in for the night. Before that, though, Jonas thought he would go out to the veranda one last time. As he walked out into the night air, he sensed a change in the atmosphere. He no longer felt just a few miles away from civilization. He felt isolated, and there seemed to be a different sense of time around the old plantation. The trees with their drooping Spanish moss closed in around the house, and there were no other sounds than the breathing of the trees in the dark and the piercing song of the crickets. Jonas moved nervously across the veranda. If he had known it would be like this, he wouldn't have come out here. He felt something on his face, and before he could brush it away, the mosquito had drawn his blood. Jonas felt his temple swelling with the bite, and he decided to go back into the house. Back in the bedroom, Jonas climbed into bed. He was shivering now. The candle on the nightstand was still burning. As he looked over at it, his eyes fell upon the book, and he picked it up. As he settled himself into bed, Jonas opened the pages to the first chapter. He read, "This story is about a young man, a northerner, who comes to the south on business. One night, he drives his car up to an old southern plantation. He decides to spend the night in the old house, even though he is all alone there." Jonas slammed the book shut and laid it back on the nightstand. He reached over and lit his pipe. His hands were shaking now as he struck another match. Then he lay back on the bed, taking long draws on his pipe. He could not get the strange coincidence of the book out of his mind. It made him nervous, but it made him curious too. He reached over and picked up the book again. In the story, the young man has just turned in for the night, after having gone out on the veranda for a while. His face is swollen from a mosquito bite he has gotten there. He scratches the bite. Jonas caught himself scratching the bite on his own face. His hands began to tremble so badly that he couldn't hold the book still. He looked up at the ceiling of the room. There was a roach crawling high on the wall. He looked over to the window. A pale moon was shining in the sky. The chorus of crickets still came from the swamp. Jonas was sweating. He wondered what the book was going to tell next. He began to read once again. The young man in the story sees a book by his bedstand. The title of the book is The Old Plantation. He picks it up and begins to read. As he reads the first chapter, his face takes on a look of fear. Then, slowly, a look of understanding comes over his face. Jonas stopped reading again. He felt the skin crawling on the back of his neck. What was it the man in the story understood? And why didn't he understand? Jonas's mind began to throb with terrible anxiety. He went back to the book. The young man continues to read The Old Plantation. The more he reads, the more frightened he becomes. Finally, he finishes the book. Then the young man lays the book back down on the nightstand. He knows there is nothing he can do but wait. Eagerly, Jonas turned to the next page of the Old Plantation. But the next page and the next page and the next page were blank. The rest of the book was blank. Jonas put it back on the nightstand. He lay there in his bed and waited. He was shaking all over now. But what was he waiting for? Suddenly, Jonas was aware that the crickets had stopped, and there was dead silence. In the moonlight, the trees looked frozen stiff. Everything seemed to have stopped. Then, Jonas heard a car coming up the driveway toward the Old Plantation. He leaned over and blew out the candle beside his bed. He didn't know what to do but wait. So he waited, without moving, while he heard the engine stop and the car door slam. He waited as he heard a key being placed into the front door. He waited, trembling under the covers, while he listened to the footsteps going throughout the house, and then stopping in front of his bedroom. Then, as the doorknob turned and the door opened, Jonas finally understood what he was waiting for. It was himself, standing in the doorway, looking at the clean little room. On the nightstand beside the bed, he saw a partially burned candle and an old book. He smiled to himself, thinking he might read the book after a walk on the veranda. It was on the top shelf of an old bookcase, covered with dust and barely visible. Lisa decided she had to find out what it was. Of all the things in the old junk shop, it aroused her curiosity the most. She had looked through old books, prints, and postcards for hours. Nothing had caught her interest, but the old box, high and out of reach, intrigued her. She looked around for the old man who ran the store, but he had gone into the back room. She saw a stepladder across the room and brought it over to the bookcase. It shook on the uneven floorboards as she climbed to the top step. Lisa patted her hand along the surface of the top shelf, trying to find the box. The dirt was thick and gritty on the board. Then she felt it. The cardboard was cold and soft from being in the damp room for such a long time. She lifted the box down slowly, trying to steady her balance on the ladder. As the side of the box reached her eye level, she could read the words, 500 pieces, stepladder, and climbed down a few steps. Then she blew away some of the dust off the lid. It billowed up around her with a musty, dead odor, but now she could make out a few more words on top of the box. The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. There were more words underneath that, but they had been rubbed away from the cardboard lid. The big picture on the cover had been curiously damaged. Lisa could just make out some areas of light and dark. It looked as though the scene might be in a room, but most of the picture had been scratched off the cardboard box, probably with some sharp instrument. The mysterious nature of the jigsaw puzzle made it even more appealing to Lisa. She decided she would buy it. The lid was taped securely, which probably meant that all the pieces would still be there. As she carefully climbed down the stepladder, holding the box in both hands, Lisa smiled to herself. It was quite a find, just the sort of thing she had always hoped to discover while rummaging through second-hand stores. The owner of the store came out of the back room as she was walking up to the sales desk. He looked curiously at the box when Lisa set it down. "And where did you find that?" he asked her. Lisa pointed to where she had set up the stepladder. "It was on top of that bookcase. You could barely see it from the floor." "Well, I've never seen it before, that's for sure," the man said. "Can't imagine how you found it." Lisa was more pleased than ever about her find. She felt as though the puzzle had been hiding up there, waiting for her to discover it. She paid the 25 cents he asked for the puzzle and wrapped it carefully in the newspapers he gave her to take it home in. It was late on a Saturday afternoon. Lisa lived alone in a small room in an old apartment house. She had no plans for Saturday night, so now she decided to spend the whole evening working on the puzzle. She stopped and bought some meat, bread, and cheese for sandwiches. She would eat while she put the puzzle together. As soon as she had climbed the flight of stairs to her room and put away the groceries, Lisa cleaned off the big table in the center of the room and set the box down on it. The strangest jigsaw puzzle in the world. Lisa read the words again. She wondered what that could mean. How strange could a jigsaw puzzle be? The tape that held the lid down was still strong. Lisa got out a kitchen knife to slice through it. When she lifted the cover off the box, a musty smell came from inside, but the jigsaw pieces all looked in good condition. Lisa picked one up. The color was faded, but the picture was clear. She could see the shape of a finger in the piece. It looked like a woman's finger. Lisa sat down and started to lay out the pieces, top side up, on the large table. As she took them from the box, she sorted out the flat-edged pieces from the inside ones. Every so often, she would recognize something in one of the pieces. She saw some blonde hair, a window pane, and a small vase. There was a lot of wood texture in the pieces, plus what looked like wallpaper. Lisa noticed that the wallpaper in the puzzle looked a lot like the wallpaper in her own room. She wondered if her wallpaper was as old as the jigsaw puzzle. It would be an incredible coincidence, but it could be the same. By the time Lisa had all the pieces laid out on the table, it was 6:30. She got up and made herself a sandwich. Already, her back was beginning to hurt a little from leaning over the table, but she couldn't stay away from the puzzle. She went back to the table and set her sandwich down beside her. It was always like that when she did jigsaws. Once she started, she couldn't stop until the puzzle was all put together. She began to sort the pieces according to color. There were dark brown pieces, whitish pieces, the wallpaper pieces, and some that seemed to be like glass, perhaps a window. As she slowly ate her sandwich, Lisa pieced together the border. When she was finished, she knew she had been right about the setting of the picture when she had first seen the puzzle. It was a room. One side of the border was wallpaper. Lisa decided to fill that in first. She was curious about its resemblance to her own wallpaper. She gathered all the pieces together that had the blue and lilac flower design. As she fit them together, it became clear that the wallpaper in the puzzle was identical to the wallpaper in her room. Lisa glanced back and forth between the puzzle and her wall. It was an exact match. By now it was 8:30. Lisa leaned back in her chair. Her back was stiff. She looked over at her window. The night was black outside. Lisa got up and walked over to the window. Suddenly she felt uneasy, alone in the apartment, and she pulled the white shade down. She paced around the room once, trying to think of something else she might do other than finish the puzzle, but nothing else interested her, so she went back and sat down at the table. Next, she started to fill in the lower right-hand corner. There was a rug and then a chair. This part of the puzzle was very dark. Lisa noticed uneasily that the chair was the same shape as one sitting in the corner of her room, but the colors didn't seem exactly the same. Her chair was maroon. The one in the puzzle seemed almost black. Lisa continued to fill in the border toward the middle. There was more wallpaper to finish on top. The left-hand side did turn out to be a window. Through it, a half-moon hung in a dark sky. But it was the bottom of the puzzle that began to bother Lisa. As the pieces fell into place, she saw a picture of a pair of legs crossed underneath a table. They were the legs of a young woman. Lisa reached down and ran her hand along one of her legs. Suddenly, she felt as though something was crawling up it, but it must have been her imagination. She stared down at the puzzle. It was almost 3/4 done. Only the middle remained. Lisa glanced at the lid to the puzzle box. The strangest jigsaw puzzle, she shuddered. Lisa leaned back in her chair again. Her back ached. Her neck muscle was tense and strained. She thought about quitting the puzzle completely. It scared her now. She stood up and stretched. Then she looked down at the puzzle on the table. It looked different from the higher angle. Lisa was shocked by what she saw. Her body began to tremble all over. It was unmistakable. The picture in the puzzle was her own room. The window was placed correctly in relation to the table. The bookcase stood in its exact spot against the wall. Even the carved legs of the table were the same. Lisa raised her hand to knock the pieces of the puzzle apart. She didn't want to finish it. She didn't want to find out what the hole in the middle of the puzzle might turn out to be. But then she lowered her hand. Perhaps it was worse not to know. Perhaps it was worse to wait and wonder. Lisa sank back down into the chair at the table. She fought away the fear that crept into the sore muscles of her back. Deliberately, piece by piece, she began to fill in the hole in the puzzle. She put together a picture of a table on which lay a jigsaw puzzle. This puzzle inside the puzzle was finished, but Lisa couldn't make out what it showed. She pieced together the young woman who was sitting at the table, the young woman who was herself. As she filled in the picture, her own body slowly filled with horror and dread. It was all there in the picture. The vase filled with blue cornflowers, her red cardigan sweater, the wild look of fear in her own face. The jigsaw lay before her, finished except for 2 adjoining pieces. They were dark pieces, ones she hadn't been able to fit into the area of the window. Lisa looked behind her. The white blind was drawn over the window. With relief, she realized that the puzzle picture was not exactly like her room. It showed the black night behind the window pane and a moon shining in the sky. With trembling hands, Lisa reached for the second-to-last piece. She dropped it into one of the empty spaces. It seemed to be half a face, but not a human face. She reached for the last piece. She pressed it into the small hole left in the picture. The face was complete. The face in the window. It was more horrible than anything she had ever seen or dreamed. Lisa looked at the picture of herself in the puzzle, and then back at that face. Then she whirled around. The blind was no longer down over her window. The night showed black through the window pane. A half-moon hung low in the sky. And Lisa screamed. The face was there too. Mr. Peebles pushed aside the curtain of glass beads that hung over the entrance to the fortune-teller's chamber. He walked inside. Behind him, the beads swung back together with a clatter. Mr. Peebles was alone in the chamber. He sat down on a chair and surveyed the room. Red and black silk curtains hung all around the walls, alternating in color. The floor was covered with brightly designed Persian carpets. Mr. Peebles looked up. Painted on the black ceiling were symbols and pictures which he had never seen before. An eerie blue light shone throughout the room. Mr. Peebles put his hands on his knees and waited. His wife had told him that he would have to wait. It was his wife, in fact, who had persuaded Mr. Peebles to come to the fortune-teller. He himself was far too reasonable a man to be interested in hocus-pocus like this, but his wife was a persuasive woman. The swishing sounds of silk against silk made Mr. Peebles look up. The fortune-teller had entered the chamber. She was a large woman with long black hair. Her costume was flamboyant. The red full dress was adorned with necklaces, bangles, and a silver belt which had a clasp designed of 2 intertwined snakes' heads. "You are Mr. Peebles." The fortune-teller announced this as a fact, not a question. "Yes, Yes, I am, Mr. Peebles stammered, suddenly flustered by the presence of this overwhelming woman. Take my hand and come to the table. The woman reached a heavily bangled arm out at Mr. Peebles. He drew his arm out to her and she clutched his hand tightly, almost fiercely. She led him over to one corner of the room where a round table sat. 2 chairs were arranged around it, opposite from each other. Sit down, Mr. Peebles, and we shall begin. Mr. Peebles stumbled into the chair to which the fortune-teller pointed and sat down. His eyes were riveted on the crystal ball which sat in the dead center of the round table. He looked at it with a mixture of amusement and fear. The chamber was much as he had expected. It contained all the typical furnishings and paraphernalia of the fortune-teller. And yet, he was uneasy here. His common sense was disturbed by the presence of this woman, who already exerted a magnetic influence over him. Look into my eyes, Mr. Peebles. The fortune-teller's voice was strong and suggestive. Mr. Peebles obeyed. You have suffered a great misfortune, haven't you, Mr. Peebles? She said, staring deep into his eyes. Yes, that's right, Mr. Peebles began. You lost the job you had for 20 years. Is that right, Mr. Peebles? Now it seemed that the fortune-teller could see behind his eyes, into his brain. How did you know? He asked dreamily. I know, the fortune-teller replied, and I know more. You fear death, don't you, Mr. Peebles? You feel the hand of death tightening around your neck. At that moment, Mr. Peebles' neck did seem to be choked by an invisible hand. He began to pour out what had been haunting him these past months. Yes, I fear death, yes. I feel that life has passed me by and all that is left for me is death. Poor Mr. Peebles, the fortune-teller's voice went on soothingly. Let me consult the crystal ball. The fortune-teller led Mr. Peebles' gaze from her eyes down to the crystal ball. It radiated an intense blue light, the eerie blue glow that Mr. Peebles had noticed in the room earlier. The fortune-teller began to drone a rhythmic chant as she stared into the crystal ball. Then, suddenly, she sucked in her breath. Mr. Peebles shifted his eyes from the crystal ball to her face. Her eyes were burning, and the black brows were knit together. I see doom before you, Mr. Peebles. What this crystal ball has told me is not pleasant. It gives a black picture of your family. Death. Her words were drowned out by Mr. Peebles' shriek of despair. His fears had been right. Death was stalking him. He felt the fortune-teller's fingers entwine in his. Mr. Peebles, Mr. Peebles. We all must die. You must simply accept it and provide for your loved ones. Mr. Peebles came out of his reverie. Loved ones. Yes, he must provide for his beloved wife, Margaret. His darling Margaret. Mr. Peebles left the fortune-teller's chamber in a daze. He stumbled from the dark room, penetrated by the eerie blue light, out into the darker blackness of the winter night. As he drove his car home, he made himself a promise. No matter what came to him and how soon, he would take care of Margaret. Margaret was standing in the hallway, waiting for him when he arrived home. To a stranger, They may have appeared to be father and daughter. She was, in fact, 20 years younger than her husband. "Margaret, it's awful. She said just what I feared." Mr. Peebles poured out his experience with the fortune-teller to his wife. She listened to his story, stroking his balding head with her soft hands. "Margaret, I promise you will be cared for. Do not worry. I plan to take out a $100,000 life insurance policy." "Whatever you want, dear. But stop this horrible talk of death." "I won't hear it any more. You laughed when I first suggested that you go to a fortune-teller, and now you take her silly predictions so seriously." Mr. Peebles felt better after that. He and his wife went to bed. The first thing Mr. Peebles did the next morning was visit his insurance broker. Despite the broker's advice to the contrary, he insisted that he take out a new insurance policy immediately. The beneficiary would be, of course, his wife. Mr. Peebles felt much better as he drove home from the insurance office, despite the meaning of what he had just done. He fell into a daydream about Margaret, how she could always keep the house and live as she did now. There was a sudden screeching sound, and Mr. Peebles' foot trembled on the brake pedal. The train engine flashed before him, followed by a constant whiz of boxcars. Their rumbling wheels on the track kept time with Mr. Peebles' pounding heart. The fortune-teller had been right about death. He had just barely escaped it. When he got home, Mr. Peebles told his wife about the train. She lay down on the couch and sobbed. To comfort her, he brought out the insurance policy. He kept repeating to her how he had made sure that she would always be protected. That afternoon, Mr. Peebles went out into the garage where he did small projects with wood to keep himself busy. Now he needed to get his mind off the morning incident with the train. He cleaned off the work table area, putting tools back in their proper drawers. There seemed to be a knife he had misplaced. He rummaged through more drawers. Then he reached up to a cabinet high above the table. As he pulled the door open, the missing knife fell from the cabinet ledge. Its sharp blade plunged down an inch away from his terrified eyes. The knife dug into the wooden workbench and vibrated from the force of its impact. Mr. Peebles backed away in horror. There was a death jinx on him. Mr. Peebles spent the rest of the afternoon lying on the couch in his study. He was paralyzed with fear. Death's bony hand seemed to be tightening its grip around his neck. He refused the dinner his wife brought him. He refused even to talk with her. Finally, in the late evening, he felt that he must get out of the house. He decided to take a walk along a deserted road near the house. He would be safe there. No traffic was allowed on that path. "Margaret," he called out to his wife, "I think I'll take a long walk on Old Mill Road. I'll be a while. Please don't wait up." Margaret came into the room and watched her husband dress for his walk. "You'll be careful, won't you? Remember what the fortune-teller said." "Yes, I'll be careful, Margaret." Mr. Peebles kissed his wife's lips. "I'll see you later," he said as he went out the door. Margaret waited until she heard the door shut. Then, with a smile on her face, she walked over to the telephone. Along the path that was once the Old Mill Road, Mr. Peebles shuffled his feet through the dead autumn leaves. He let memories of his life drift in and out of his mind. It seemed so peaceful here on the path. Mr. Peebles began to think that the fortune-teller could be wrong. Then, he was blinded by two headlights. Speeding toward him, straight down the middle of the path, was a huge car. He knew immediately that this was the end. Death had him in a stranglehold at last. Mr. Peebles stared at death as it bore down on him. In the seconds before he died, he saw the face that death wore. It was the face of the fortune teller behind the wheel of the car, and on the dashboard in front of her was the crystal ball. The stuffed dog sat on a low table in the darkest corner of the study. It was a black boxer with short, bristly hair that was still sleek. Mrs. Heathcote dusted it every week and rubbed oil into its hair every month. She took good care of the boxer in remembrance of her husband, the late Mr. Heathcote. He and the dog had died on the same day, 20 years ago. The dog had been devoted to Mr. Heathcote, and his wife liked to think that it had died out of grief at its master's death. The coroner, however, didn't find that a satisfactory explanation. Mr. Heathcote, you see, had died a very mysterious death, and when the boxer died the same day, the coroner had naturally been very suspicious. He ordered an autopsy of both bodies, Mr. Heathcote's and the dog's. But no medical cause for either death had been determined. Mrs. Heathcote buried her husband and had the boxer stuffed. It had sat in that corner of the study for 20 years. Except, that is, on one day of each year, the anniversary of Mr. Heathcote's death. On that day, Mrs. Heathcote would lift the stuffed dog in her arms, carry him to the car, and drive with him beside her on the front seat to the cemetery. There, she would lay the dog on top of her husband's grave. She would smile to herself, imagining that the three of them were all together again. This year, Mrs. Heathcote had asked her grandson Theodore to help her carry the dog to the cemetery. She had been having back trouble, and the stuffed dog was quite heavy. Theodore was 12. He had never met his grandfather, and he didn't understand why his grandmother took the stuffed animal to the cemetery every year. But, at his mother's insistence, he agreed to spend this weekend with his grandmother. He arrived early Saturday morning, the day of the pilgrimage to the cemetery. "Teddy, you're so grown up," Mrs. Heathcote said as she squeezed Theodore up against her, just as she had always done. Theodore drew away from his grandmother. He noticed that his glasses had become smeared by something on her apron. As he pulled out his handkerchief and started to clean them, he said, "Don't call me Teddy." "Oh, yes, Theodore. I'll try to remember," Mrs. Heathcote said apologetically. "Now, come along and help me with the dear doggy. It looks like it may rain today, so we must be off to the cemetery right away." Theodore followed his grandmother into the house. He began to wish he hadn't let his mother persuade him to come. As he walked into the study, he felt the revulsion creep into his body. It was the same revulsion he had always felt toward this room. He despised the stuffed dog. As a child, he had been locked in this room once by his grandmother as punishment. He had sat in the room in the slowly fading light until it was pitch black. And during that whole time, the stuffed dog had stared at him with its beady eyes. He remembered how the cruel snarl on the dog's lips had haunted him in nightmares for weeks afterwards. He remembered how the dog had filled him with a sinister feeling of fear. It was dead, and yet It seemed so not dead. Teddy, Theodore, pick the dog up, his grandmother said. Theodore walked over to the dog, but the idea of touching it made him sick. Really, Theodore, we must hurry. Lift the dog from the table. Theodore put his hands on the stuffed dog. Its greasy fur felt unnatural to him. He lifted it from the table and carried it to the car as fast as he could. He set it on the front seat. His grandmother came out of the house as he started to get into the back seat. No, Teddy, sit in front with me and the dog. There's plenty of room. As usual, Theodore obeyed. He moved the stuffed dog over on the seat toward his grandmother. They were silent on the drive to the cemetery. Mrs. Heathcote seemed wrapped up in memories, and Theodore found the whole situation too ridiculous to talk about. He wondered if his grandmother was going batty. They arrived, and Mrs. Heathcote stopped the car near her husband's grave. Teddy, Theodore, bring the dog now. Theodore picked up the dog again. Its face stared up at him, the mouth fixed in that awful snarl. Following his grandmother's directions, Theodore lay the dog on top of his grandfather's grave. He asked to be excused then. He wanted to get away from his grandmother and the dog, and the creepy feeling he had from being around them. After a half-hour of walking around the cemetery, Theodore came back to his grandfather's grave. His grandmother's eyes were red and swollen from crying, but her face was beaming with a smile. Isn't it so lovely, Teddy, seeing the two together again like that? Theodore tried to hide the disgust on his face as he looked at the stuffed dog lying on the grave. Is it time to go now? He asked. Yes, dear. Bring the dog back to the car. Theodore bent down and picked up the dog. Then he let it fall back onto the grave. Theodore, what is wrong with you? Mrs. Heathcote asked angrily. But Theodore didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to tell her that the dog seemed warm now, as if it were alive. He fought the sickening disgust that he felt, and stooped down to pick it up again. Yes, the dog was warm. After he got the dog back into the car, Theodore went into the back seat and refused to move up front. During the ride home, all he could think of was having to pick the dog up again. When they arrived home, Theodore gritted his teeth and carried the dog into the house. He never looked at the animal. He set it down in the study and rushed out of the room. Mrs. Heathcote watched him, shaking her head. My, Theodore, you certainly are acting strange today. You young people haven't any sense, do you? Theodore wanted to leave his grandmother's house, but he had no choice. His mother had promised he would stay overnight. Theodore vowed never to go into that study again. He passed the afternoon reading. While he was eating his grandmother's delicious supper, he was almost happy he had stayed. The two of them settled down to play checkers after the dishes were washed. They played for 2 hours. Theodore even let his grandmother win one game. You've tired me out, Theodore, Mrs. Heathcote declared sleepily after losing for the 15th time. Be a good boy and fetch the matches from the mantel in the study. I want to light a candle in your room tonight. I want it to be just like when your mother was little. Mrs. Heathcote began her slow walk up the stairs to the bedrooms. Bring the matches up when you come to bed, Teddy. Theodore looked around the living room for a pack of matches, but he couldn't find any. There weren't any matches in the kitchen drawers either. Finally, He walked up to the study door. He opened it and looked inside. It was too dark to see anything, even the dog. He decided to get the matches without turning the light on. He knew exactly where the mantel was in the room. He slipped inside and felt along the wall until his hand reached the mantel. His fingers closed around the matchbox. Just then, he thought he heard a noise from the corner of the room. A noise like a growl. Theodore struck one of the matches against the box. In the burst of light from the match, he saw the dog's beady eyes looking at him. A wave of hatred came over Theodore. That cursed dog. With the match trembling in his hand, Theodore walked toward the stuffed dog. He looked at the fat jowls sagging around the cruel mouth. He stared into the beady eyes. As he came nearer to the dog, he saw its long whiskers. Theodore laughed and shoved the match into those ugly whiskers. Upstairs, Mrs. Heathcote was putting on her nightrobe when she heard the scream. It was a horrible, terrified scream. She rushed down the steps as fast as her old legs would carry her and hurried into the study. Theodore was lying on the floor. His face had a look of terror on it. His arms and legs were sticking out stiff from his body. "No, not again," Mrs. Heathcote panted as she ran to call the doctor. The doctor arrived within 10 minutes, but that didn't matter. Theodore was already dead. The doctor said there would have to be an autopsy. Mrs. Heathcote nodded in agreement. "He looks so much like my husband when he died," she said wistfully to herself. They carried Theodore out of the study, and once again, the room was left in darkness. Then, a low snarl came from the corner, and a drop of bloody saliva fell from the stuffed dog's mouth. Long ago, a small village was plagued by a monster. The monster had never been seen nor heard. It never left tracks or evidence. The only proof of its existence was its victims. The victims were always killed in the same manner. 10 jagged holes would be found in their necks. At first, the monster attacked only small animals. A farmer woke one morning to find that 3 of his sheep had bled to death. Then, 3 pet dogs in the village were found dead, with the same strange claw marks in their necks. Rumors circulated in the village. Everyone heard about the animals, but no one could give a logical explanation for what had killed them. Next, a young calf was found dead. It had bled to death too, its jugular vein punctured by the 10 mysterious holes. After this, men began to arm themselves. Shotguns were set beside beds at night. Animals were kept locked inside the barns. Throughout the village, a rash of hysteria broke loose. People put forth all kinds of wild speculation, and neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Then it happened, what everyone had really feared. The monster attacked a human, Elmer Riley, the town drunk. Elmer was found dead one morning, with the 10 claw holes in his neck. He had died just like the sheep and the dogs and the calf. He had bled to death. Not many people in the town really cared that Elmer was dead, but it scared them to know that the monster had an appetite for humans as well. Anyone could be its prey. The men of the village banded together to form a vigilante group. They didn't know what they were fighting, which made things even worse. 2 brothers, Robert and John Harmon, were appointed head of the vigilante committee. They lived on the outskirts of the village, near the forest where most people thought the monster lived. The 2 brothers knew how the monster attacked. It had been their calf that was killed. After the first meeting of the vigilante committee, Robert and John Harmon went home to discuss their plans. They sat around the oak table in the kitchen with their father. Their old grandmother sat by the fireplace on a low chair, her black shawl wrapped around her. "We must begin the watch tonight," Robert said in a low voice. "The other men are afraid to act now, but I think tonight is the time to be on guard." "You're right," his brother agreed. "The thing, whatever it is, strikes every 5 days. It was 5 nights ago that Elmer Riley was killed." "You boys sound brave," their father interrupted. "But remember what you are dealing with. The thing seems to attack without warning. In the killing so far, there were no signs of struggle. How will you know what to watch for?" The father paused and looked over at his old mother sitting by the fireplace. "They should be careful, shouldn't they, Granny?" The old woman looked up at her son. She shuddered for a moment and then fell silent again. The 3 men went back to their conversation. They hadn't really expected to get an answer from her. Her mind had been foggy for years. Robert began to outline his plan for his father. "John and I will both take our guns to the outskirts of the forest tonight. We'll set ourselves up on the path between the forest and the village. If the monster comes out tonight, it'll have to pass by either one of us." "And what protection will you have?" the father asked worriedly. "Each other," Robert answered. "We'll stay within shouting distance of each other, and we'll keep our backs to the village so that we face the forest and the monster." "Someone has to do it," John said next to his father. "We don't know who the next victim will be. We can't just sit back and let the monster kill us off one by one." Their father stood up from the table and walked a lap around the room. Then he shook each of their hands. "Please come back to me alive," he said, his voice choking. The 2 sons picked up their rifles from the floor. Robert pulled a long, sharp machete from off the wall. As they left the room, both of them walked over to their old grandmother and kissed her goodbye. Outside, the night was nearly pitch black. A thin sliver of a moon hung low in the western sky. They walked east, toward the forest. As they drew near to where they had planned to station themselves, John whispered, "I wonder what it looks like." "I've been thinking," Robert said, "that it could be a bird. A giant bird that swoops down on you and digs its claws into your neck." They both looked up into the night sky. Clouds were shrouding the thin moon. It would be hard to see a dark shadow descending through the sky. "I thought it might tunnel under the ground like a huge weasel," John said softly. "Then it comes out and attacks you from behind." Both brothers felt the skin crawl on the backs of their necks. Slowly they turned around and looked behind them. For several minutes they stood there like that in the dark, paralyzed by their own horrible thoughts. "We must take our places," Robert said finally. "But remember, stay within shouting distance." The 2 brothers moved off in opposite directions. They had agreed to take 20 long paces and then stop. Standing in the dark, Robert carefully cocked his gun. Then he took the machete and stuck it in the soft ground by his feet, and waited. 40 paces away, John fumbled nervously with his gun. He felt his hands shaking. Could he use the gun if he had to? He wished he could see Robert, but his brother was obscured by the dark shadows of bushes and trees. John turned around to look toward the village. He wished he were safe inside the house. Then he heard the crackling of a twig in back of him. He spun around to face the forest but saw nothing and heard no more. John relaxed. He set the butt of his gun down on the ground and leaned against it, and he started to feel drowsy. And then he felt the 10 claws digging into his neck. A terrified scream echoed through the forest to Robert. He grabbed his gun and machete and followed the awful screams to his brother. He drew near but couldn't see anything in the dark night. But then he heard John's voice, choking and desperate. "Quick! Swing the machete behind where you hear my voice! Hurry!" Robert threw down his gun, grasping the machete in both hands. He swung it above his head and let it fall. It made a hacking sound before it hit the ground. John had been groaning the whole time, but now he stopped. For an instant, Robert thought he had killed his brother. But then John started to babble incoherently. Robert thought he heard something moving back away from them. It sounded like a giant rat scuttling over the dead leaves. But he could not see it. He fell down on the ground by his brother's body. Moaning again, John took his brother's hand and put it up to his own neck. Robert shrunk back at what he felt. It was a hand, a withered hand with sharp, pointed claws. He had hacked it off the monster with his machete, and it was still stuck inside of John's neck. Robert jerked the foul claws from his brother's neck and bound the 10 bloody holes with his handkerchief. He carried his brother back to the village, leaving the withered hand lying on the forest floor. Their father met them at the door, weeping with fear. He had heard John's terrified screams in the forest. Now he wept with happiness to see that both his sons were alive yet. They laid John out on the couch and washed out the claw marks in his neck. They could see that a few seconds more and the claws would have killed him. As he bandaged his brother's neck, Robert thought about the monster. He hoped it was in the forest now, dying a slow death. All this time, no one had noticed that the old woman was gone from her spot by the fireplace. And no one noticed when she came in through the back door and sat down there again. From her low seat, she looked over to Robert and John. No one heard the hiss that came from her wrinkled mouth, and no one saw the bloody stump that she hid underneath her black shawl.